Our guest is Dr. Lewis Baldwin, and the topic is the significance of African American history, the beginning of African American History Month. And of course, Dr. Baldwin, let's have you during the second segment to talk about some of your own personal experiences dealing with the civil rights movement, the marches, and that kind of activity, because I think that that has that would be as significant as anything that we could talk about here today.
Well, the civil rights movement actually came of age during my high school years in Camden, Alabama. I was in high school in 1965. I was actually a sophomore when the Selma campaign started for the voting rights, if you remember that. And as you well know, students got caught up in the movement in the 1960s. In the 1950s, it was basically a movement with personalities like Martin King and E.D. Nixon and Rosa Parks and others. Young people were involved, but not on a large scale. But in 1960, we know, 1960-61, the student sit-in started in Greensboro and Nashville, parts of Alabama, Atlanta, and of course the Freedom Rides in 1960-61. I think during that period, young people injected a new dynamic into the civil rights movement. Martin King called it a new spirit of resistance. Because the struggle in the early 1960s in many cases was waning. We know that the struggle in Albany, for an example, in 1961-62 with Martin King was basically a fiasco. But what changed the movement, of course, was the coming of age of students and the involvement of students in sit-ins and freedom rides, etc. Colleges like Albany State in Georgia, Alabama State, Shaw University in North Carolina, American Baptist College, Tennessee State, Fisk. These institutions provided students who actually injected a new dynamic into the civil rights movement. In fact, we don't often recognize it, or we don't often think about it, but the sit-ins and the freedom rides, those were not developed by the leadership of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. King and the other leaders did not come up with those ideas. Those ideas came from students, primarily college students. Some high school students were involved. And I had a chance to witness some of that and also to participate in some of it. And I can't tell you what that meant in terms of my own personal growth. In terms of my own vision of who I should be and what I should become. And as I said earlier, that was part of the inspiration for my decision to study African American history and culture.
You know, to think of becoming involved in the freedom rides, why don't you say something about the courage of these individuals, the ICC ruling, etc. We get it to it from that.
Yeah, the freedom rides were, as I said earlier, quite a significant event in the modern civil rights movement. The freedom rides in 1960-61 actually started out in Washington, D.C. With white students sitting at the back of the bus and black students at the front of the bus. And of course, they traveled from Washington, D.C. to points in the South, the Carolinas, Georgia, Alabama, ultimately Mississippi. It took a lot of courage because if you remember what happened when they reached Anniston, Alabama on Mother's Day in 1961, they were beaten by Klansmen in Alabama. White and black students, very courageous, very devoted to the cause. They had to confront armed sheriffs, constables, mob violence. But in the midst of all of that, they had the courage to persevere and to demonstrate the absurdity of segregation in interstate travel. And that was very, very important.
And of course, the sit-in movements, the freedom rides, and all of these things play a very, very significant role in helping to move the civil rights movement further. You know, Dr. Baldwin, one aspect of this has been the Civil Rights Act of 1964, I think that we've often talked about. Why don't you say something about that and say something, I know you've talked about the economic impact of Title VI and et cetera. Speak to it from that instance.
Yes, well, a lot of times we get caught up in our discussions of the movement, of various events that occurred in connection with the movement. And we often forget that there was another side of the struggle with people like Thurgood Marshall and others who were dealing with the legal issues in relationship to the movement. But the 1964 Civil Rights Act was a landmark act passed, signed during the President Lyndon Johnson's administration. It opened public accommodations, job opportunities for blacks. It was an important decision, but I don't think you can take it in isolation from the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Both of those are important in the sense that they sort of advanced the struggle for basic civil or constitutional rights, and also for political enfranchisement. Dr. King always said that with the signing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the very first phase of the movement ended. That phase that was geared toward the achievement of basic civil or constitutional rights. The second phase began with the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which meant that African Americans in the South had achieved political enfranchisement. And from that point, of course, we know that he began to address issues of economic empowerment and international peace, which were very, very important. But another important thing that we have to consider is that the Civil Rights Movement brought about a renaissance in black studies. We were talking earlier about Black History Month. Scholars began in the 1960s, late 1960s, early 1970s, began to give more serious attention to the study of African American history, African American religion, African American culture. We saw black studies programs developing in universities and colleges across the country, black church studies programs in seminaries and divinity schools. So all of this was occurring in the 1960s. And I don't think you can understand these developments apart from the kind of vitality that young people brought to the movement.
Well, now, Dr. Baldwin, we've got a minute before our commercial break. When we come back, what we'd like for you to do is to speak in reference to what young people might do. As you indicated, you had an opportunity as a young person to participate in the movement and some of the more dangerous aspects of the movement and et cetera. But today, I think that many of our young people are sort of aimless. They don't have any real vision and et cetera and et cetera.
That's so true.
And so with the experience that you've had dealing with the movement, the experience that you've had in terms of studying about the significance of African American history and et cetera, when we come back, I want you to sort of zero in and to, in a real sense, speak to our young people and let them know what they have to do in order to not only to participate, but to vote and et cetera and et cetera. And so let's have you to do that. And of course, we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. The topic is the significance